Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Conversations podcast. My name is Patrycja Rozwora and I'm the host of this platform where we speak about contemporary art from so-called Eastern Europe. In each episode, you're going to be introduced to one artist or researcher whose visual or activist practice sheds light onto the complex former socialist region with all its histories, cultures, languages, foods, but also traumas and their inevitable contemporary consequences. The podcast is a fully independent platform existing since May 2020. If you enjoy the monthly conversations, you can show your support by buying me a symbolic coffee or sharing this episode with your friends or via social channels. All the necessary links can be found in the show notes of this episode. Welcome back, everyone. Happy to have you tune in again. To record this episode, I traveled all the way from Berlin to London. In collaboration with Contemporary Links and the Polish Cultural Institute in London, I conducted a conversation about an exhibition of works by Polish interdisciplinary artist Franciszka Themerson that is right now on view in Tate Britain. The artist and the exhibition will be introduced to you by two curators, Hilary Floe and Saskia, as well as Weronika Gertig Burgess, who is working for the Themerson estate in London. So let's jump right into it.
Yeah, well, welcome to Tate Britain. It's so lovely to have you. My name is Hilary Floe. I am Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary British Art here at Tate Britain. And I led on the development of this lovely one-room Francziszka Themerson display, ably and brilliantly assisted by Saskia, who I'm handing over to right now.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm Saskia. I'm the Assistant Curator of Modern and Contemporary British Art and joined on this project about 6 months ago, which has been a total joy. And I took on the baton from my predecessor, Mikhail Goldschmidt, the former Assistant Curator, gone elsewhere, flown the nest. So it's been a joy to work on this project and to work closely with the estate.
Hello, my name is Weronika Gertig Burgess. I am here as an agent representing the Themerson estate, which I work very closely with Robert Defchitz and Jasia Reichardt, who is the niece to Stefan and Franciszka Themerson. And thank you so much for having me here today. We're very delighted for this celebration of Franciszka's body of work and this exhibition.
Yeah, thank you. Very exciting. Just today in the morning, the display opened.
Yes, hot off the press. It's the first day.
Yes, and I just arrived today and immediately from the airport to the museum to meet you.
People tell us that all the time.
So for those who are not familiar with the work of Franciszka, I guess we would have to start there. Could you introduce the artist to us? What is important to know about her and her work?
Well, there's a lot to say, but I think she's one of the most important European modernist artists of the 20th century. She's born in Warsaw in 1907, in a family with Jewish heritage. She trains as a musician before pursuing art as her calling. She's very active in interwar Warsaw and Paris as an avant-garde figure, often in collaboration with her husband, Stefan Themerson, who appears in places in the display as well. And we're able to exhibit her at Tate Britain, which is ostensibly an institution devoted to British art, because she fled Nazism in occupied France to London in 1940 and worked here for the rest of her life, where she made an enormous contribution to painting, drawing, illustration, graphic design, theatre design, almost everything. It's not the first time we've had works in our collection here at Tate. We've been proud to have and show some of her body of work in the past, but we're celebrating the recent acquisition of a particularly special painting, Comme la violente et comme l'espérance est violente. That's my horrible French, which has just entered the Tate collection literally weeks ago. We are, yes, commemorating this recent purchase from the estate of the artist by staging a display bringing together a selection of her work.
Prior to this conversation, I was able to briefly see the display, and you told me that you've been working on it more than a year now.
Yeah, about a year and a half, maybe a little more, which in Tate years is almost nothing.
Yeah,
but which has nonetheless been a really joyful period of research and investigation, working really closely on numerous visits to Jascha Reichert's home, the estate of Franciszka Themerson in North London.
Could you tell me a little bit about the process and about your decision of showing this art and telling this story in this museum and how it kind of adds to the history of British art?
Yeah, it feels very timely to celebrate her in this way. At Tate Britain, we focus on art made in Britain rather than necessarily by artists born in Britain. And mid-century, around the Second World War, obviously there's enormous amounts of forced migration. I mean, the majority of the works in the display were made after she moved to this country, and the kind of extraordinary cross-fertilization of creative ideas that she brings with her from these European avant-gardes, the contribution she makes to avant-garde practice in this country, and also the unusual opportunity to see Blitz London, for example, through the eyes of a young Polish woman. It's not always necessarily the perspective that we place at the heart of our narratives, but I think it's so important that we do.
And since Weronika, you're here from the Themerson estate, I would be curious to know how the collaboration or like process of preparing such a display works. So how does the collaboration between a museum and an estate looked like in the past months, the past year?
It would be very difficult to represent without a retrospective exhibition on Francziszka Themerson, her full body of work at Tate. The display starts with representative works from early 30s and 40s. So in that sense, one could say that it is a short testimony of her life. And we have been working with Hilary also in the past. So this collaboration was happened very organically. The painting that is the recent acquisition of Tate has been previously also exhibited at the Barbican exhibition, New Art in Britain, over a year ago. So it's beautiful to see it again here at Tate.
Yeah, I really fell in love with Francesca's work when I was working on Post-War Modern, the Barbican exhibition that you mentioned. We were able to borrow this painting from Jascha and the estate. It was absolutely one of the highlights of the show for me, and I was really delighted to moved to Tate not long thereafter and discovered that they were working on an acquisition. So I was not the only one who felt so strongly that it belonged in the National Collection.
And, for the benefit of the listeners, I think it's important to note that Jascha Reichert is a true icon of British art, the British art scene. She was Francziszka's niece, the only surviving member of both Stefan and Francziszka's family from the Holocaust. She was brought to the UK in 1946 as a child and lived with them all her life and is now 90, but you wouldn't know it because she's an extraordinary force of nature. She herself is a very important curator and the first female curator of the Whitechapel, I believe. Director, sorry. So her voice has been really crucial to bringing this display to life, and not only her encyclopedic knowledge of Stefan and Francziszka's lives and artistic practices, but also her perspective as a curator and her perspective as somebody who knew them so well. So this is one of those kind of dream partnerships between the institutional curators like Hilary and I, and also the estate and the family, and getting that kind of first-hand anecdotes and knowledge, which is just absolutely crucial.
Just wanted to add about the painting that we are here to admire, the recent acquisition. The painting has been actually hanging on Jascha Reichert's walls for many years. And for her, it really represented peace and relaxation. She often tells the story how she would imagine those two heavy figures trying to climb the surface of the painting in order to overcome these those lines which often appears, at Francziszka's paintings. So the title of the painting, as Hilary mentioned, comes from French poetry, which often we don't know what would come first. Was it the painting or was it the title? But this is a reflection on what Francziszka was reading perhaps at the time. So the title comes from Guillaume Apollinaire, When the Life is Long, the Hope is Difficult. And it was painted in the precarious times after the war in 1959. So for others, it may represent hope and future and those two loving figures moving towards to a better place.
I think one has to notice the specific technique. So there's like very thick layers of paint and the figures are kind of drawn into the paint. Can you speak a little bit about that, the technique and what it meant for Francziszka?
It's fascinating, isn't it? She has a very distinctive and unusual technique. And I think it's almost like she's found a way of drawing into oil painting. So she worked by covering her canvases with a very, very thick layer of oil paint and then almost scoring into it, not with a brush apparently, maybe with the handle of a brush or with fingers or some other tool that she had. And then she would cover those incised lines, which often sort of cross-hatch the composition with layers of transparent glazes. Weronika, stop me if I'm getting this wrong at any point. But and then those glazes pick out the incisions and accentuate them so that you have the real sense of her line dominating the canvas. But the surfaces are they're rough and craggy and they look old. And so they have a very tactile, warm quality to them. They look very organic, as though perhaps they've survived millennia. And she was in fact very inspired by the cave paintings at Lascaux, which she saw in the mid-50s. Her work was compared to like modern cave paintings, and she was hugely delighted by that description because she loved them so much, and she felt there was something about the timeless human expression that she identified with.
And those paintings that you're showing in the display, as you said, were created post-World War II. So the search for meaning after such a traumatic experience was a topic that in this time, a history of art, a very prominent one. I'm curious to hear a little bit about the figures she's showing. Those are, as I think I already heard, like very loving, very touching. So something actually quite warm-hearted rather than connected to something we would expect as the visualizing of the trauma of the Second World War.
Yeah, that's so right. I mean, it's a very tender painting. And for those of you who maybe don't have a perfect recall of it in your minds already, it's grey and white, and it has these two very dominant, almost marshmallow-like square, white, fluffy-looking figures with tiny arms and legs. And they're pressing their little bodies together as though they're trying to squish themselves into one form. So it feels very romantic in a way, that there is a love story there that you sense. But the title also indicates this element of melancholy and the fear of loss that might accompany that. And, you know, perhaps it's whimsical to imagine this as a representation of Francziszka and her partner Stefan, because she never wanted a singular interpretation of her works. But given the trauma of their more than 2 years of separation, I think it's hard not to read some echo of that experience into the composition.
What's really wonderful about the display is having the drawings and the paintings in the same room, because you can really see how the figures in the drawings kind of continue on in the sort of language of the painting. So you get these kind of roughly drawn, sketched figures, often quite playful, often quite silly, but always with this weighty, important sort of aspect to them. So a classic of Francziszka's is a sort of semi-self-portrait figure of her, where she kind of renders herself, but usually upside down, and often with these very large eyes. So in this particular painting that we've been talking about, Comme la vie, she is sort of upside down in the corner with these big eyes. Kind of, it's a sort of whimsical thing, putting herself on the different plane to the figures in the painting. It's a kind of almost like a signature, sort of putting herself in there as a kind of, I'm watching you kind of tongue-in-cheek joke. And I think it's connected to her feelings that paintings exist in their own planet. There's a good quote from her where she talks about the world of the canvas. The laws of gravitation have no right in the space of a picture, which has its own laws. That's a sort of great Francziszka kind of little comment where for her, the picture plane is really a free space, uninhibited by human laws. And so in this painting, she's upside down. And in one of the other paintings we have, you've got these two figures which have kind of like propellers on their noses, as if they're kind of flying off into space, or, you know, they exist in their own laws.
I think this notion of the alternative perspective, the topsy-turvy world, is this thread that runs through the little display that we've put together. You know, when she's writing about her upside down or alter ego, she says, well, am I upside down or is the world upside down? And similarly, we titled the display Walking Backwards after this character the lead character in her short film, The Adventure of a Good Citizen, who's determined to see the world differently by walking everywhere in reverse. And there's a silliness to this, but there's also a deep seriousness about the idea that we should seek new ways of looking at the world, and that ultimately that's how humanity moves forward. So it's not a silliness without purpose. It's deeply motivated, and I think we all need to find our own ways of walking backwards, or indeed hanging upside down.
Yeah, and definitely something very current and relevant for these times as well. And that's always beautiful to see that work that was done quite some years ago can still be read into current times. We were already mentioning the drawings that are displayed on two walls of Franciszka's room. The drawings were done before the paintings, like around 10 years before, so in the 40s, during the Second World War. And the collection you are showing is a work titled Unposted Letters. And those are drawings and indeed letters that Franciszka wrote while already living here in London and being separated from her husband.
As you rightly point out, the drawings take up the majority of the display. They're over two walls. So the series of unposted letters were made between 1940 and 1942, which was the precise period of time in which Franciszka and Stefan were separated. They had been living in Paris as part of the kind of avant-garde artistic circles when the war broke out in 1939. At which point they both signed up to serve in the Polish army from France. Franciszka was assigned as a cartographer and an illustrator, while Stefan was drafted into a division. And that's really what instigated their separation. And in fact, in the display, we have a kind of chronology that kind of traces those particular war years, because it's very heartbreaking. Eventually, Franciszka finds herself in London while Stefan is moving through France in various locations, often in hiding as Nazism becomes increasingly more prominent. So these drawings are Franciszka's way of dealing with this separation, not knowing where Stefan is, not knowing whether he's safe. For several months, she has no news of him at all. And then through friends, she finds out he's alive in France. And in the kind of 2 years that follows, there's very sporadic communication. Letters take months to arrive, or weeks, or, you know, they go often in sort of out of order, or maybe never at all arriving. And if anyone is interested in learning more, there is a phenomenal book published by the estate that outlines all these wonderful letters. So they are written letters, but also drawings. And I think for Franciszka, the drawings are just another kind of language. And in these drawings, she's imagining Stefan's escape. She's sort of depicting her own life in London. She's thinking about her family in Poland. And so they are simultaneously playful and funny and full of pathos, and also deeply heartbreaking. So we couldn't present them all, unfortunately, but we did make a selection of what we felt were some of the strongest ones, and we hope that visitors will enjoy seeing them.
How many can we see?
There are 28 on display. And then alongside that, we also have a vitrine that kind of contains an original letter, which is sort of a beautiful kind of counterpoint to the drawings.
We felt it was very important to make sure that there was a really rich context available to our visitors when looking at these drawings, because even though they are literally depicting bombs falling in some cases, there's also a really determined search for levity and absurdity in the world around her. There are animal characters and Alice in Wonderland figures and a sense of the nonsensical, which I felt could be misunderstood without a real understanding of the profoundly traumatic experiences she was living through when she made those. I mean, humor runs throughout her work and is one of the most delightful aspects of it, but it feels particularly politically vital at this moment when she's, bombs are falling on her. Her husband is is a man of Jewish heritage in an occupied Nazi country. Her family is facing starvation, and she is representing the world around her, but with this defiance in her decision to, seek out humor and human silliness and integrate that into these images that swing between, I guess, horror and lightness, or fuse them together in some way.
And in the display, you are indeed showing one of the written letters, so letters made out of text, not the drawing that she also in some way saw as letters. You're showing one of them. The visitors can read it, and I thought maybe today we could also read the letter in a way to also understand what Franciszka actually herself thought about this time and the way she drew.
Franciszka later named this series of work Unposted Letters because she never sent them. That's a very obvious thing to say, but just so the sort of visitors are aware that these letters and the drawings come from a period in which she felt too embarrassed to send them to Stefan because either they wouldn't get there, or if they did get there, they'd go through several different people's hands, and therefore she didn't feel like she could be tender or romantic with him. There's a sort of embarrassment there. And it's quite striking when you compare the letters that she did send versus the letters that she kept privately, because in the letters she does send, they're often full of, don't worry about me, I'm doing very well, I have enough money, is there anything you need? I'm very happy, please don't worry. And then in the letters that she writes and doesn't send, they're full of the reality of her situation and the kind of real tragedy that she's living through, and the worry and the fear and the sense of isolation, being so far away from both Stefan and her family in Poland. Franciszka to Stefan on the 1st of December, 1940. Darling, what are you doing now? Where are you? Who do you talk to? It's very hard for me, and so I must write to you again and again. On the left side of the writing pad are blue envelopes. Again, I can't put this letter in the envelope and send it. So many people will read it on the way. I feel idiotic. And if it reached you, you would only feel sad to know how much I miss you and that there is nothing to be done about it. I would so much like you to be able to have some quiet life there. I'm so frightened that you will break out one day over the mountains or something. I thought for a long time what to answer to your long, darling telegram. I waited 2 nights to stop myself writing stupidities to you, and I still don't know if I did the right thing to give you the address of that man who may not even be in Toulouse yet. And you might think that it has more significance than it has. And what I wrote about America, but perhaps that is what you prefer, my love. For me, they're equally good. And anyway, it probably won't work out in the end, because how could it? And if you sent me an answer now, then what happens, my darling? Will these times leave us some memories? Will this modest temporary state one day find form as some paintings, words, emotions, and scents? Such a nothing is happening with me. I try with all my strength to compress myself inside everything that could leave any trace. Quietly, quietly. This has to pass. It will pass. Only not to think of what will be, how it will be then. I should like to be a child now, absorbing a whole range of impressions, things that are already inaccessible to old cows like me, to be able to store something that might change itself one day into energy. Idiocy. But there are moments when I regret, that I don't have a child, yours and mine, for whom this English apartment would be a whole world and not 4 rooms for 4 guineas, for whom London fog and the red ball of the sun would be more than a landscape, that momentarily clutches at my throat, in a choking memory of visual sensations, for whom the environment would still remain to be discovered, absorbed and cultivated, to whom one could explain how awful it is what is happening now, and to whom that wouldn't be so boringly obvious, but a revelation. And perhaps one would have to say how it should be in the world, and this perhaps would be a signpost. But the way it is, it's a matter of gritted teeth and eyes closed. Behind my burning moist eyelids, it's impossible to disentangle all the confusion of recent events from the turmoil of childhood memories that churn around in my head and torment me. These times won't leave any treasured memories. There is no fragrance in the air today to linger pleasantly in my mind. No people whose way of life would be a dear or moving thing to recall. There is nothing. I can't imagine that I shall ever be able to work again. I don't believe that I can ever start from the beginning. I don't believe in anything. I can imagine only one thing, to work with you back in Poland. And I know, of course, that this is impossible and that we shall never go back there. That's terribly hard to accept. Well, what are our mothers doing there, darling? It is not possible just to abandon them there. And don't say that one can do nothing at all about it. Is this where our brave new ideas of citizens of the world have got us? It is all so difficult, so very difficult. Can one swim if the water you're in just comes up to your ankles? But that's the only thing that saves us from drowning. In 3 weeks, Christmas. In 1 month, a new year, 1941. Give me a hug, darling.
I very frequently start crying when I read these letters. She has such a way with words. And what it underscores for me is how much courage she managed to summon for herself in order to create works of art under these circumstances. And also how beautiful it is that the works of art become a way of preserving herself and holding on to her connection with Stefan.
We just mentioned line and words. And actually, Franciszka herself said that she, as we know, the line and drawing is at the core of her practice. As Hilary mentioned before, you know, she was so experimental in her techniques that she would oftentimes draw into a paint or draw by pouring paint onto fresh canvas. And she herself said that she would value the line in the same way as she valued the word. So when she had nothing to say, instead of talking, she would draw. So it was her flexible language. It was like writing. And these unposted letters, they were, in a sense, a pictorial journal of, you know, and a way for her to survive. And humor, of course, it's a survival's necessarily component. So it is always present, as both of them, Franciszka and Stefan, were full of humor.
And thank you so much for sharing it also here as a whole. In the podcast, often we speak about work, but we cannot show it. But in this way, there will be part of her work and her words in this podcast, which is also very beautiful. And in the last part of our conversation, I wanted to go to the 30s and the films Franciszka created together with Stefan, still back in Poland. And I think a lot of the Polish audience or the Polish listeners will indeed recognize the name Themerson from the avant-garde, the Polish avant-garde, the very experimental black and white films. In your display, we can see 2 films out of 5 independent short films they created. One of them, Europa, made in 1931. And the interesting fact about this film is that it was thought lost until 2019, so fairly recently.
So yes, Europa was originally believed to have been looted by the Nazis when Themersons were still living in Paris. And only in 2019 it was rediscovered. It was stored in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin. So the museum has contacted Jasia Reichardt, the estate, and we have restituted the film back to the estate. And it was first shown to the audience here in London in 2021 during the British Film Festival. So this is the second time we're showing the film. It is based on a poem by Anatol Stern, which talks about the fall of Europe. It's a short film, as what characterizes the film, avant-garde films from the early 30s from Poland. The Themersons made, they were short and oftentimes used both photomontage, different techniques, and actors. Photograms are a big part of the technique that Themersons used.
Can you explain what it is?
An image that is created not by the camera, but by placing objects on a sensitive surface of a light surface, sensitive material to create images.
Europa, we've had the great privilege to borrow from Lux. The other film we're including, The Adventure of the Good Citizen, is in Tate's collection. And we have two other films, which are also very wonderful, but which we've shown before. And because this display centers on the wartime experiences and has the films and the paintings as kind of brackets either side of that core around Francesca's experiences during World War II, it felt maybe very interesting to include two of her most political works. I should say this, these were both made with Stefan. Europa is a work that is incredibly prophetic about the rise of Nazism, about the rise of fascism across Europe, about the dangers of nationalism, as well as being an extraordinary avant-garde piece of film. And I know that film historians had talked about this and researched and written about this film for decades without it even existing. So its rediscovery was a really extraordinary moment for people interested in early cinema.
The combination of Europa, which was their second of the 5 films they made, and then also Adventure of a Good Citizen, it really kind of sets the stage in the display. So it really gives this fascinating insight into the context in which the drawings and the paintings are then made over the following decades. They are both examples of extraordinarily avant-garde experimental techniques. There's a lot of fast cuts, short edits, this kind of repeated imagery, kind of they're sort of collages of moving image and still image, all kind of woven together. And they often have these kind of repeated visual motifs that kind of echo throughout. So when you think about them in the context of Francesca's drawing and painting practice, they have this kind of interesting resonance in terms of the kind of experimental aspect of her practice, but also their approach to form and image making and kind of that sort of visual language. So it's very nice to kind of have them not just for sort of historical context, which is of course crucial, but also for the kind of technical, artistic materiality of her very prolific career.
And Hilary already mentioned that at the beginning of the conversation, but I would like to have that now in the film chapter as well. One of the films, the second one, The Adventure of a Good Citizen, was also an inspiration for the title of the display.
It was. So The Adventure of the Good Citizen, made by Stefan and Francesca in 1937, has a central character who decides to walk backwards, to view the world differently. And this triggers in the film a hysterical reaction by a mob who become convinced that this will tear a hole in the sky. It's a very funny but also pointed parable about intolerance and the power of the artistic imagination in the context of rising right-wing intolerance across Europe in this time and the persecution of the avant-garde. It really reads as a warning, I think, against the suppression of the individual voice. So we loved the idea of pulling out this idea of walking backwards as an expression of what Francesca stood for in her art, which was finding ways to view the world differently. It feels like a message for our times.
I wanted to ask like a general question about the audience of this display, of this exhibition. Who do you want to speak to? What do you expect from the audience and the conversation between the artwork and the people who come here to Tate Britain? Maybe each of you could say something.
Oh, definitely. The joy of working at Tate Britain is that we have a very wide audience. As the national collection, we attract visitors from across the country, from around the world, old and young. And I think her work has something to say to everyone. I imagine this show perhaps appealing especially to younger audiences because there's something about the humor and the joyousness of the work that I think could really appeal to the young. It's not just that she's referencing things like Alice in Wonderland or Edward Lear and that she was in fact a brilliant children's illustrator. So she recognized herself that her artistic language spoke to children and young people. But I also think there's a really powerful political message about safeguarding the individual voice and finding courage and creativity in difficult times, which might resonate right now.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Also, I loved for audience to see how amazing Franciszka, during the times when she was active, there was not so much recognition or emphasis on women artists at the time. However, her husband really admired her work, and they were this avant-garde power couple, which is also great to see, especially now when we see the art history being rewritten and so many overlooked women artists are being rediscovered and recognized again. So that's also great to see.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've both articulated extremely well what we hope visitors will kind of get from this display. I guess all I'll add is that it's free and it's open to all, and the joy of providing something like that is that what I hope is that somebody will just stumble across it, that they won't necessarily know what they're in for and they won't have heard of Franciszka before, and they'll just walk into that room and discover a whole world of her imagination and feel kind of touched by it and inspired by it. And you kind of can't hope for anything more than that as a curator, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Weronika, Hilary, and Saskia, for sharing expertise and the way you worked with the work and on the display. It's always great to hear from the curators how you thought about presenting it. And I'm looking forward to going back and seeing the work again. And it will be here till the 30th of March 2025, so plenty of time to come and visit. And this was it for today. Thank you for reaching till the end of this episode. The next one is coming in 4 weeks, always on Monday. Please follow the podcast and leave a rating. I'm also happy to hear your feedback, so feel free to write me via Instagram or by email. All the needed info you will find in the show notes of this episode. In the meantime, take good care and we hear each other soon.